James Sterling was a man who understood the limits of the electronic eye. In 1988, he was a senior tactical analyst for the CIA's Counter-Terrorism Center, a man whose career had been built on the transition from the old world of spies to the new world of signals intelligence. He believed in the absolute authority of the thermal sensor, the directional microphone, and the overhead satellite. He believed that if an enemy moved, he could be tracked, and if he could be tracked, he could be neutralized. He believed in the American way of urban warfare: saturation, monitoring, and rapid response. "We thought we knew how to control a city," Sterling wrote in a classified memorandum for the Department of Justice. "We had the most advanced surveillance architecture ever deployed in an urban environment. We had the REMBAS ground sensors, the infrared cameras, and the encrypted radio nets. We believed that technology had rendered the hiding place an anachronism. But in the late 1980s, in the grey, rain-slicked streets of West Belfast, I realized that we were blind. We were looking for the enemy on a screen, but the enemy was living in the walls, and the only people who could see them were a different species of soldier who had learned how to stop being human for 14 days at a time." The setting was the Murder Mile, a stretch of road in Belfast that had become a laboratory for the most sophisticated urban insurgency in the Western world. The Provisional IRA had turned the city into a patchwork of no-go zones. They moved through the terraced houses like ghosts, using a labyrinth of knock-through walls and underground passages. Their snipers were the stuff of nightmare. They didn't fire from rooftops. They fired from the back of vans, from holes in chimneys, and from positions that the British Army's conventional patrols simply couldn't find. "The statistics were devastating," Sterling recalled.
British soldiers were being picked off at a rate that the Ministry of Defence couldn't sustain politically. The IRA snipers weren't just lucky, they were disciplined. They understood our technology. They knew where our cameras were pointed. They knew the sweep of our patrols. They were operating in the acoustic shadows of the city. I was sent to Belfast to evaluate our surveillance support for the British. I expected to find a high-tech command centre. Instead, I found a man sitting in a dark, damp basement, staring at a single brick. Sterling's first encounter with the 22nd Special Air Service in Northern Ireland was not a scene of action. It was a scene of terrifying, absolute stillness. He was taken to a nondescript apartment in a loyalist area of Belfast by a quiet Royal Marine colonel. The apartment looked normal from the outside, laundry on the line, curtains drawn. Inside, it was a hollowed-out shell. "I saw 3 men," Sterling noted. They weren't wearing the black kit of the Prince's Gate legend. They were in civilian clothes, faded jeans, old sweaters. They looked like the very people they were hunting. But it was their eyes that unsettled me. They weren't looking at me. They were looking at the wall. Specifically, they were looking at a small 2-inch gap where a single brick had been removed and replaced with a piece of tinted glass. They had been sitting in that room in total silence for 6 days. This was the human hide. To the American mind, this was a failure of resources. Why put 3 elite operators in a room for 6 days when you could install a remote camera? Why waste the most highly trained soldiers in the world on the task of a security guard? I asked the SAS sergeant, a man identified only as R, why they didn't just use a digital sensor, Sterling said. R didn't look away from the glass. He spoke in a voice that was so low it barely registered on my recorder. He said, "James, a camera doesn't have a gut. A camera doesn't feel the change in the air when a door opens 3 houses down. A camera sees the light, but it doesn't see the intent. We aren't here to watch. We're here to wait. And a machine doesn't know how to wait properly." This was the institutional patience of the regiment. It was the product of the Brecon filter, the selection process on the Brecon beacons that the Americans found so archaic.
To the CIA, the long drag was a test of fitness. To the SAS, it was a test of sensory isolation. It was about finding the individual who could be alone with his own mind in a storm for 20 hours and not break. The SAS operator is flattened by the mountain so that he can be rebuilt as a biological sensor, Sterling explained. In the hide, the thinking soldier philosophy reaches its most extreme conclusion. They delete their own needs. They don't eat hot food. They don't use the bathroom. They urinate into bags and defecate into plastic containers, sealing them to prevent any scent from escaping. They rotate in 4-hour shifts of absolute unmoving observation. If you move your head too fast, the shift in the shadow behind the glass might be noticed by an IRA scout, so you don't move. You become a statue made of meat and memory. The target for the Team R was an IRA quartermaster, a man responsible for the movement of the Barrett .50 caliber rifles that were terrorizing the patrols. The British had spent months trying to find his cache. They had used drones, they had used informers, and they had used electronic intercepts. Nothing worked. The quartermaster moved only during the grey hours of the morning, and he never used the same route twice. He was a master of the city's geometry, Sterling said. He knew how to move through the blind spots of our cameras, but he didn't know about the hide. He didn't know that 3 men had turned themselves into part of the brickwork of an old bakery. He didn't know that for 144 hours, Sergeant R had been watching the way the smoke drifted from a specific chimney and the way a certain dog barked when a stranger approached. As the clock ticked toward the 7th day, Sterling watched as the arithmetic of the hide began to yield results. There was no sudden breakthrough. There was no eureka moment. There was just a slow, meticulous accumulation of data points that no machine could process. R whispered to me on the 7th night, Sterling recalled. He said, "He's here, James. He's not in a car. He's not even on the street. He's using the drainage culvert behind the garage. He's been there for 3 nights, waiting for us to stop watching. He thinks he's found a gap in the patrol rhythm." Sterling checked his own digital monitors. The ground sensors showed nothing. The thermal cameras showed only the heat of the sewers. The machine said the street was empty, Sterling noted. But R was already reaching for his L96A1 sniper rifle. He wasn't looking at the screen. He was looking at the geometry of the culvert. He knew that the enemy was there, not because he saw him, but because he felt the silence of the street change. This was the moment where the different species proved their worth. The American era of technological saturation was about to be eclipsed by the British era of biological persistence. But the 14-day wall was about to demand a final, brutal price from the men inside it. And James Sterling was about to witness the moment where the thinking soldier has to decide if he is still a man, or if he has truly become part of the brickwork. The smell of a hide is something that no CIA training manual could prepare James Sterling for. It was a thick, stagnant cocktail of unwashed bodies, stale oxygen, and the sharp chemical tang of urine stored in plastic bladders. In the high-tech surveillance centers of Langley or Fort Meade, surveillance was an antiseptic experience, conducted in air-conditioned rooms with ergonomic chairs and the hum of servers. In the walls of West Belfast, it was a slow process of biological rot. I had been in the hide for only 48 hours, and I was already beginning to hallucinate, Sterling wrote in his personal log. The cramped space, a void less than 4 feet wide, carved between the brick exterior and a false interior wall, was a sensory coffin. Every muscle in my body was screaming for movement. But the 2 SAS troopers, R and a younger man named T, hadn't shifted an inch. They sat on their haunches, their eyes fixed on the green cat spotting scopes, their breathing so shallow it didn't even fog the lenses. They had effectively lowered their own heart rates to near hibernation levels. They weren't just soldiers. They were cold-blooded predators waiting for the environment to reveal its secret. To understand how a human being can remain motionless for 14 days, you have to look past the physical training and into the neurological architecture of the SAS. In the American Special Forces, the emphasis is often on action-oriented competence, the ability to execute complex maneuvers under fire. But the Brecon filter in Wales is designed to find a different trait, the capacity for active boredom. The long drag on the beacons isn't just a test of the legs, Sterling noted. It's a test of the mind's ability to remain online when the body is begging for the off switch. On the 64-kilometer march, the candidate is alone for 20 hours. There is no one to talk to, no music, no stimulation, just the rhythm of the boots in the fog. This creates a psychological flatness. It produces a soldier who doesn't need external stimuli to stay alert. In the hide, this flatness is a weapon.
While a normal soldier would start fidgeting or lose focus after 4 hours, the SAS operator enters a state of hypervigilant stasis. He becomes part of the wall because, in his mind, he has already been part of the mountain. The enemy they were hunting was the South Armagh sniper team, the most lethal insurgent cell in the IRA's structure. These were men who had been trained in the United States and the Middle East. They didn't use the rusted AK-47s of the street militias. They used the Barrett .50 caliber M82A1, a weapon capable of penetrating the engine block of a British Pig armored vehicle from a mile away. The IRA snipers were professionals of the grey space, Sterling explained. They didn't hide in obvious places. They used vans of death, delivery trucks with a small, hidden firing port cut into the rear doors. They would drive into a street, fire a single shot, and be gone before the sound had even finished echoing off the brickwork. They understood that the British Army's response time was measured in minutes. They operated in seconds. To catch them, the SAS realized they couldn't be faster than the sniper. They had to be present before the sniper even arrived. Sterling watched as Sergeant R adjusted the focus on his L96A1 rifle. The weapon was a masterpiece of cold-bore precision. It was designed to hit a target with the first shot, every time, without the need for a sighter. But in the hide, the rifle was the least important piece of equipment. The most important was the scent discipline. The SAS troopers didn't eat meat, Sterling observed. They lived on a diet of bland, cold vegetarian pastes and high-calorie biscuits. They didn't use soap. They didn't use toothpaste. They knew that in the tight urban canyons of Belfast, a scent can travel. If an IRA scout, often a child or an elderly woman, passed by the air vent of the hide and smelled the clean scent of an Englishman's soap or the hot scent of a military ration, the hide would be burnt. A compromise meant more than just the end of the mission. It meant a firebomb through the window. So they smelled like the damp, like the coal dust, and like the rot of the city itself. They had deleted their human identity to survive. On the 9th day, the geometry of the hide began to shift. The city of Belfast has a rhythm, a social pulse that James Sterling's computers were trying to map. They tracked vehicle movements, phone calls, and electricity usage. But R wasn't looking at the big data. He was looking at a single house across the street, number 42, a derelict terrace with boarded-up windows. R whispered to me in the middle of the night, Sterling recalled. He didn't move his head, just his eyes. He said, "James, look at the pigeons on the roof of 42. I looked through the thermal.
The birds were just sitting there. I didn't see anything. R continued. They've moved 3 times in the last hour, always to the same spot on the chimney. There's heat coming out of that stack, but no one lives there. And the heat isn't from a fire, it's too steady. It's the breath of 3 men. Sterling was stunned. His multi-million-dollar thermal scanners had dismissed the chimney as background noise, the residual heat of an old city. But the SAS trooper had integrated the behavior of the birds into his tactical assessment. The machine sees the heat, Sterling wrote, but the man sees the reason for the heat. R had identified the sniper's nesting site because he understood the biology of the city. He knew that even in a no-go zone, certain patterns remain. Pigeons don't sit on a cold chimney in a Belfast rainstorm. They seek the warmth. The birds were the IRA's unintentional informants. The tension in the hide became a physical weight.
They were now in a jewel of stillness. Across the street, the IRA snipers were likely in their own version of a hide, waiting for a British patrol to pass by. Both sides were statues, separated by 30 meters of wet asphalt and a decade of hatred. This is the thinking soldier at the absolute limit, Sterling said. R had the target. He could have called in a quick reaction force, QRF. He could have had an armored company on that street in 5 minutes. But he knew that if the heavy boots arrived, the snipers would vanish into the knock-throughs, the secret passages between the houses. To kill the cell, he had to wait until they committed to the shot. He had to let the predator come out of the shadows. Sterling watched as R's finger rested lightly on the trigger guard of the L-96. Not on the trigger, but the guard. It was a 2.5-pound pull, hair-thin. I asked him what he was thinking about, Sterling recalled. In that silence, in that smell, in that decay. R didn't answer for a long time. Then he said, I'm thinking about the geometry of the bounce, James. When he fires that 50 cal, the muzzle blast is going to hit the boarding on that window. It's going to vibrate the wood for a fraction of a second. That's my window. I don't shoot him. I shoot where the wood moves. The 14-day wall was no longer a prison. It was a weapon. And as the grey light of the 10th morning began to bleed through the clouds over Belfast, James Sterling realized that the different species were about to perform a surgical removal that no computer could ever simulate. But as the grey hour approached, a new variable entered the street. A variable that would test the institutional patience of the SAS to the breaking point. A variable that the thinking soldier has to account for, even when the heart is screaming to pull the trigger. By the 11th day, the hide had stopped being a room and had become a biological extension of James Sterling's own body.
He no longer felt the itch of the coal dust in his lungs, or the dull ache in his lower back from sitting in a permanent crouch. His world had narrowed to a 3-inch circle of glass, and the rhythmic, almost hypnotic breathing of Sergeant R.
The 11th day is where the normal mind breaks, Sterling wrote. In the CIA, we have psychological profiles for long-term isolation, but those profiles assume a desire for escape. The SAS troopers didn't want to escape. They had entered a state of combat trance. They were so attuned to the street that they could tell the difference between the sound of a rain gutter dripping and the sound of a door latch being quietly turned 2 houses away. They were no longer observing the city. They were feeling its pulse through the brickwork. The grey hour, the hour between 4:30 and 5:30, when the night's shadows are at their deepest and the morning's light hasn't yet arrived, was the window of the South Armagh sniper. It was the time when the human eye is at its weakest, struggling to resolve shapes in the monochromatic gloom. R moved his hand to the L96, Sterling recalled. He didn't grip the stock.
He just rested his palm against it, as if he were checking the temperature of a living thing. He whispered, "The van is coming, James. Not the one from the big bakery. The one with the mismatched hubcaps. It's a minute off its usual route. That's the signal." Sterling checked the electronic sensors. "Nothing," he whispered back. "No radio traffic, no thermal spikes." "They don't use radios," R replied, his eyes never leaving the scope. "They use the rhythm of the milkman. They move when the city expects movement. Look at the window of number 42. Through the spotting scope, Sterling saw the boarded-up window of the derelict house across the street. A single piece of plywood shifted, not by inches, but by millimeters. It was a firing port, carefully cut to match the grain of the wood.
Behind it, the massive shark-like barrel of a Barrett .50 caliber sniper rifle began to emerge. But then, the human variable entered the geometry. A group of 3 teenagers, no older than 15, walked into the middle of the street. They were wearing hooded sweatshirts, kicking a deflated soccer ball between them. They were laughing, their voices echoing in the pre-dawn silence. One of them stopped directly in the line of fire between the hide and the sniper's nest. In the American Tactical Manual, this is an abort criteria, Sterling noted. You cannot prosecute a target with non-combatants in the kill zone. The risk of collateral damage is 100%. I looked at R, expecting him to back away from the rifle. Instead, I saw his body become even more still. He wasn't aborting, he was recalculating the geometry. This was the moral abyss of the thinking soldier. The SAS knew that a British Army Pig armoured vehicle was scheduled to turn the corner in exactly 90 seconds. If R didn't take the shot, the IRA sniper would pull the trigger of the .50 caliber. The round would penetrate the vehicle's armour and decapitate a 19-year-old soldier from Liverpool. But if R fired now, the supersonic shockwave or a slight deflection could kill the boy with a soccer ball. The tension in the hide was a physical pressure, Sterling said. I could hear the rumble of the British patrol approaching. Thud, thud, thud. The teenagers were still there, arguing over a foul. The IRA sniper was ready. I saw the flash of a cigarette being extinguished inside the dark room, the final clearing of the lungs before a shot. R whispered to Trooper T, "Windage check. 3 clicks left. Account for the thermal drift from the chimney. I'm taking him through the plywood, not the gap." "Ah!" Sterling hissed. "The kids! You can't!" R didn't look at him. "The kids are the early warning, James. The IRA put them there. They know we won't shoot if they're in the way. They're using the rules of engagement as armor, but they haven't accounted for the geometry of the apex." The apex was a specific point on the street where the teenager's movement and the sniper's line of sight intersected for a fraction of a second. R wasn't looking for a clear shot. He was looking for the interference pattern. "I watched the boy with the ball," Sterling recalled. "He leaned over to tie his shoe. For a second, his torso dropped 6 inches. It was a window of space no wider than a dinner plate. At that exact moment, the British pig turned the corner at the end of the block. The IRA sniper adjusted his Barrett. I saw the muzzle move." In the hide, R didn't exhale. He didn't follow the standard sniper breathing cycle. He held his breath in a state of pulmonary stasis. "No," R whispered. The L-96A1 didn't roar. It produced a suppressed thud that sounded like a heavy book falling on a carpet. But the physics of the shot were a masterpiece of biological computation.
The 7.62mm round traveled across the 30 meters of asphalt, passed exactly 4 inches above the head of the boy tying his shoe, and struck the plywood boarding of number 42. It didn't go through the firing port. R had aimed at the pivot point of the wood, the spot where the sniper's cheek would be pressed against the stock. The plywood exploded in a spray of splinters, Sterling said. The IRA sniper never even saw the flash. The round passed through the wood, through the Barrett's optics, and into the target's cranium. The van of death that was supposed to act as the extraction vehicle accelerated away, its tires screaming. The teenagers froze for a second, then scattered into the alleys. They didn't even know a shot had been fired. The British patrol, the 4 men inside the pig, continued their route, completely unaware that they had been seconds from death.
They didn't know that 3 men in a wall had just saved their lives with a geometric resolution. But the hide wasn't clear. R stayed on the rifle, Sterling noted. He didn't celebrate. He whispered, "T, there's a second one. In the back room. He's reaching for the backup weapon. James, get the QRF on the net. The ghost walk is over. We're going kinetic." Sterling reached for his radio, his hands shaking for the first time in 11 days. This was the different species in the light, he wrote. They had spent 260 hours being statues, but in 4 seconds they had transitioned into machines of violence. They had solved a moral and tactical puzzle that would have paralyzed a computer. They had saved the patrol, spared the child, and deleted the threat. But as the British sirens began to wail in the distance, and the quick reaction force began to swarm the street, James Sterling realized that the 14-day wall had one final secret to reveal. A secret about the price of the wait. Because as Sergeant R finally pulled his eyes away from the scope, Sterling saw something in the man's expression that made him realize that the hide hadn't just been a place to watch the enemy. It had been a place where R had left something behind, something that he would never be able to recover. The surgical removal was complete, but the biological decay of the operator was just beginning to show. At 5:45 on the morning of the 11th day, the street in West Belfast was a landscape of blue, flashing lights, shouting soldiers, and the smell of diesel fumes from the British Army pigs. The quick reaction force had arrived, swarming number 42 with the loud, aggressive energy of conventional infantry. They were kicking in doors, shouting orders, and securing the area with a massive display of force. But for James Sterling, standing inside the dark, stagnant air of the hide, the noise of the army felt like a violation. "The contrast was physically painful," Sterling wrote. "I had spent nearly 270 hours in a world where the loudest sound was the beating of my own heart. I had lived in a space where a whispered word was an event. Now, the world was screaming. I watched Sergeant R and Trooper T through the dim light of the false wall. They didn't join the shouting. They didn't move toward the door to greet their comrades. They began the process of disappearance. In the SAS, the mission isn't over when the shot is fired. The mission is over when the environment has forgotten you were ever there." Sterling watched, fascinated and repulsed, as the 2 men began to dismantle their biological prison. This was the geometry of the erasure. Every piece of equipment, the scopes, the L96A1 rifle, the radio batteries, was wiped down with clinical precision and stowed in waterproof bags. But it was the waste management that most unsettled the American analyst. They collected every bag of urine, every container of feces, every scrap of food packaging, Sterling noted. They even used a small vacuum to collect the hair and skin cells that had fallen from their bodies over the 11 days. I asked R why they were being so meticulous. The QRF was already outside. The IRA knew someone had been watching. R looked at me, his eyes sunken and bloodshot, and said, "James, the IRA knows someone was here. But if they find a single hair, a single DNA sample, or a specific brand of biscuit, They don't just know someone was here. They know who was here. They know the size of our team, our metabolism, and our habits. To stay alive in this city, you have to be a ghost. And a ghost doesn't leave skin behind. This was the institutional paranoia of the regiment. It was a recognition that in the Grey War of Northern Ireland, information was more lethal than a bullet.
The most difficult part of the erasure was the biological re-entry.
After 11 days of near total immobility, the human body begins to shut down its primary locomotive systems. The muscles of the legs and lower back had entered a state of atrophy lock. I tried to stand up, and my legs simply refused to function, Sterling recalled. I collapsed against the brickwork, my nervous system misfiring. I felt a wave of nausea and vertigo that made the world spin. But R and T didn't collapse. They began a series of isometric wake-ups, subtle rhythmic contractions of the muscles to force blood back into the limbs without making a sound. They had been doing this for hours before the shot, preparing their bodies for the transition from statue to machine. It was a form of self-torture that they treated as a technical requirement. As they finally emerged from the back of the building, disguised as a civilian utility crew, Sterling saw the different species in the light of day for the first time. They didn't look like the elite warriors of the Prince's Gate myth. They looked like ghosts, gaunt, grey-skinned men with a smell of damp and decay that seemed to radiate from their pores. We were driven back to a safe house in the suburbs, Sterling wrote. I expected a debriefing, a meal, perhaps a bed. Instead, I found a decompression cell. The SAS doesn't just let you walk back into the world after a hide. The transition is too violent. Your brain is still tuned to the frequency of a drip in a rain gutter, while the world is moving at 80 miles per hour. You are a thinking soldier, whose thoughts are still stuck in a 3-inch circle of glass. Sterling spent the next 24 hours watching R in the safe house. The sergeant sat in a chair in the corner of a room, staring at a blank wall. He didn't sleep. He didn't eat. He just sat. I asked the SAS major in charge of the detachment what was wrong with him. Sterling said,
The major, a man who had spent his own youth in the walls of Derry, told me, he's recalibrating James. In the hide, R had to delete his ego to become a sensor. Now he has to find it again. But the problem with the Brecon filter is that sometimes it flattens the ego so thoroughly that there isn't much left to find. He's not staring at the wall. He's waiting for his personality to reboot. This was the hidden price of the 14-day wall. The American Special Operations community, focused on platform integration and technological overmatch, had never considered the neurological cost of biological persistence. We train our Delta Force operators to be high-output systems, Sterling concluded in a report he never fully submitted to the CIA. We want them to be explosive, fast and lethal. We want them to dominate the room. But the British have found a different way. They have found a way to turn a man into an infinite output system. A man who can provide a steady stream of intelligence and lethal precision from a state of total, soul-crushing silence. But to do that, they have to break the man's connection to the normal. They have to turn him into a creature of the grey space. The final part of the geometry of the erasure occurred a week later. Sterling was back in London, preparing for his flight to Washington. He saw a small news item in the Belfast Telegraph. It reported a fire in a derelict house in West Belfast. The cause was listed as an electrical fault. The house was number 42. The SAS had returned, Sterling realized. They had waited a week, and then they had burned the hide and the sniper's nest to the ground. Not to destroy the IRA's materials, the army had already seized those, but to store pamięć o prostranstwie. We udalili geometrię swojego prisutstvia iz materialnego mira,
Sterling met Sergeant R one last time in a pub in Hereford. R looked different.
He was clean-shaven, wearing a fresh sweater and drinking a pint of bitter. He looked like a normal Englishman. But when he looked at Sterling, the analyst saw the shadow that would never leave. "I asked him if he would go back," Sterling recalled. "I asked him if he could endure another 14 days in a wall, smelling his own rot, watching a street that didn't want him there." R took a slow sip of his beer and looked out the window at the rain. He said, "James, the wall is easy. It's the street that's hard. In the wall, I know exactly what I am. I'm a sensor. I'm a trigger. I'm the standard. Out here there's too much noise. I can't hear the silence anymore." The 14-day wall was the ultimate demonstration of institutional patience. It proved that in the age of the satellite, the most dangerous weapon was still a man who knew how to wait. But as Sterling boarded his plane, he realized that he had witnessed the end of a certain kind of humanity. He had seen the different species in the moment of their most perfect and most tragic evolution. The surgical removal was a success. The IRA sniper was dead. The patrol was safe. But the men in the wall had paid a price in biological currency that no government could ever repay. And James Sterling, the man who believed in the pixel, was left with a final haunting image. The image of a single brick, a piece of tinted glass, and the eye of a ghost that refused to close. The debriefing room at the CIA's headquarters in Langley, Virginia, was a space of clinical high-tech perfection. In the autumn of 1988, it was filled with the brightest minds of the National Security Agency, the Office of Technical Service, and the Directorate of Science and Technology. On the massive projection screens were the thermal maps of West Belfast, the intercepted IRA communications, and the specifications for the next generation of smart grid urban surveillance sensors.
James Sterling sat at the end of the long mahogany table, feeling like a man who had returned from a different century. He looked at his colleagues, men in crisp white shirts who believed that the world was a series of equations to be solved by more powerful processors. "The report is incomplete, James," a senior director said, tapping a pen against a digital tablet. "You've documented the hit on the South Armagh sniper cell. You've documented the recovery of the Barrett .50 caliber. But where is the technical data on the human hide? What frequency were they using for the telemetry? What was the resolution of the optical relay? We need the specs to build the American equivalent." Sterling looked at the director and felt a sudden, sharp memory of the smell of Sergeant R's unwashed body and the sound of his shallow, rhythmic breathing. "There is no technical data," Sterling said quietly. "There was no telemetry. There was no relay." The room went silent. The analysts looked at each other, confused. "Then how did they maintain the observation?" the director asked. "Our satellite passes showed that the house was derelict. No power, no thermal signature, no electronic emissions for 14 days. How did they process the data?" "They didn't process it," Sterling replied. "They witnessed it. They used a pencil, a piece of paper, and the human nervous system. They sat in a void for 300 hours until their brains were synced with the vibration of the street. They didn't need a sensor because they became the sensor." Sterling realized then the great divorce between the American and British philosophies of war. The United States was building a machine that could see everything but understood nothing. The British were building a man who could see nothing but understood the rhythm of the intent. "I told them about the standard of the ghost," Sterling recalled in his private memoirs.
"I explained that the SAS selection process, the long drag, isn't a physical test of the legs. It is a psychological pruning of the ego. It is designed to find the individual who can exist in the data zero environment. When the battery dies, when the sensor glitches, and when the logic of the machine says there is no one there, that is where the SAS begins. They don't have a manual for the hide because the hide is a state of mind. The analysts at Langley couldn't process it. They wanted a repeatable, programmable formula. They wanted something they could outsource to a defense contractor. "You can't buy 14 days of silence," Sterling taunt them. "You can't buy a man who is willing to rot in a wall for a 3-second window. That isn't a capability. It's a culture. It's the result of a regiment that has been operating in the blind spots of history since David Sterling first sketched a memo in a hospital bed in 1941. They don't seek credit. They don't seek medals. They seek the geometry of the job. And once the job is done, they disappear, leaving nothing behind, not even a hair." James Sterling retired from the CIA in 1995. He never spoke publicly about his time in Belfast. He moved to a small town in the Pacific Northwest, a place of constant rain and grey fog that reminded him of the grey hour in West Belfast. On his desk, he kept a single object, a small, chipped brick he had taken from the debris of number 42 after the fire. It was a reminder that in a world of billion-dollar failures, the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield is still a human being who has been flattened until there is nothing left but the mission. "People ask me why we couldn't stop the IRA in the 70s and 80s with all our technology," Sterling said in his final interview. "I tell them that technology is a crutch. It makes you loud, it makes you heavy, and it makes you predictable. The IRA was defeated because they encountered a force that was quieter than they were. They were defeated by the different species, men who had traded their humanity for the ability to become a wall. The 14-day wall remains one of the most secretive and effective chapters in the history of the SAS. It was a victory of biological persistence over technological saturation. It proved that the thinking soldier could operate in the ruins of the human psyche and emerge with a surgical result. But the final cost of the hide is one that no military budget can ever account for." Sterling recalled his final meeting with Sergeant R in Hereford. He had asked R if he ever missed the hide. "R looked at me with those sunken, ghost-like eyes," Sterling said. "He told me, 'James, in the hide, I was perfect. I was the standard. I didn't have to worry about the noise of the world or the choices of the living. I just had to be the geometry. Out here I'm just a man again. And being a man is the hardest mission I've ever been on.'" As the sun sets over the Brecon beacons today, a new generation of candidates is lying in the mud, being told that they are nothing. Most of them will quit. Most of them will return to the normal. But one or two will find the quiet space between heartbeats. They will learn to read the boil of the city and the shadow step of the ghost. They will become the next generation of the different species. They will be the ones who live in your walls, watch your streets, and wait for the geometry of the intent to reveal itself. Because for the SAS, the wall never ends. The wait is just another Tuesday. And the only standard that matters is the one written in the silence. Who dares, wins.